Brethren, my name is Ravi Kudesia, and I'm the chaplain of Joseph Webb Lodge, located right here in the Grand Lodge of Masons in Massachusetts, in downtown Boston. I'm sitting here in Corinthian Hall in my seat as chaplain to tell you a little bit about Freemasonry in light of Vedanta. Now, I was invited to be part of the seminar based off an article that appeared in the Philadelphia Journal in fall of 2010 called Journeying Eastward, and it's going to serve as the rough template for this presentation. Now, the first thought may be, well, Vedanta is an Indian philosophy, and Freemasonry is without any doubt a Western institution that came up most likely in medieval England. So one might ask, what relationship is there between the two? Now, there are a lot of similarities in some senses. For example, when Brahmin boys are initiated into the mysteries of India, they're endowed also with a cable toe that's wrapped 3 times around them to remind them to remain pure in thought, in word, and in deed. The symbol of the scythe of time, right, of time being a symbol of death, is also very common in the great epic, the great sermon, the great philosophy poem of India known as the Bhagavad Gita. The great master of yoga, Krishna, bestows upon his choice disciple a vision. And in this vision, he sees both good and evil being sucked into the giant mouth of this overpowering divine entity. And Arjuna asks this entity, "Who are you?" And the entity responds back, "Kalosmi lokakshaya kritpravrado," meaning, "I am the end of time, the devourer of all planets and all worlds." So there are similarities in terms of the concepts, some of the symbols, some of the techniques, even, if you will. There's a quote from the Upanishads, the ancient discourse-related philosophy of India, whereby they talk about the blindfolding and the hoodwinking and being taken to distant lands. And so there is a great similarity, but that's not what this presentation is about. What I've found is that there are, in all places, in all times, in all cultures, these similar philosophies that blossom. And it's been known to some as the concept of a perennial philosophy that blooms in all cultures. The expression of it has been different, but the core philosophy has been the same. Now, what we find is that when we try to articulate this philosophy with words, it inevitably gets reduced to dogma, to superstition, to one book being the only book. And that's why there's always been an esoteric approach which has been based on symbols. But symbols have a very interesting aspect to them, which is that they both conceal and reveal. If you know the deeper idea behind the symbol reveals a whole rich depth. But if you don't, the symbol can also be a barrier. It can serve to conceal important information. And so the craft of Masonry has, as its supreme strength and perhaps greatest inadequacy, a rather paradoxical nature. It is replete with meaning, yet completely devoid of it. That's how this article begins. And what we start to talk about then is this question of when somebody goes through the degrees, they get some basic understanding of Masonry as a moral philosophy. However, it's certainly more than just a moral philosophy. As Albert Pike said, these degrees are also intended to teach more than morals. The symbols and ceremonies of Masonry have more than one meaning. They hint it only, at least. And their varied meanings are only to be discovered by reflection and study. So, an initiate goes through the ritual and goes through the degrees and sees a very rich, numinous feeling. But then they're given a very superficial and moral emphasis or basis upon which these symbols are explained. The square to square your actions, the compass to circumscribe your desires. These sort of teachings. So it's very hard sometimes to reconcile the difference between the feelings, the intuitive, deep feelings that these symbols bring about and the teachings that were given about them. And we find this in many places. And I'd like to give an example now that we hear about very briefly in the third degree, which is the idea of the ark, right? The ark is a symbol that we've seen in all cultures, in all places, in all times. It's Sumerian, it's Hebrew, it's in the Greco-Roman canon, it's Aztec, the Chinese have it, the Hawaiians have it. The story of a great flood, an ark, and the progenitor emerging from that ark. And it's a very powerful symbol. Granted that it's written out in literary terms in our books, but it's a symbol. We close our eyes and we imagine and see and relate with that ark on a very deep level. Now, scientifically, we know that there was no time where one human being populated all of the earth. It can't be as it's presented in literature. It can't be that way historically, factually, scientifically. But on the other hand, we can't deny it because there is a powerful, universal impulse that draws us towards the story. So it's in these two that we tend to clash culturally. Our logic versus our faith, our science versus our religion, and there's all sorts of trouble that comes from this. Now the question is, what is this symbol trying to teach us? This symbol of the ark and the progenitor of the ark. Well, the story appears in the Indian canon as well. It's said that there was a great king named Manu. In fact, our English word man is derived from the name of Manu, the progenitor in India. And he was a very righteous man. He was performing oblations to God in a pond, and a little fish came to him and said, help me, help me. There are all these big fish here, and these fish are going to swallow me alive. So because he was so compassionate, he takes the fish and puts it into a pot. The fish grows too big for the pot, so he puts it in a tub. Too big for the tub, so he puts it in the river. Too big for the river, so he puts it in the ocean. Then he says, surely you must be something. You're not a normal fish. You must be God Almighty. In fact, the fish reveals itself and says, yes, I am God. And you've built this ark throughout your entire life. And there's going to be a time where the world is going to become dry, desolate. It's not going to be conducive to life anymore. And at that time, you have to come to this time, or to this place, enter into this ark, and I will lead you. And sure enough, there comes a time where the world becomes dry, desolate, and so Manu enters into the ark. He sees the fish, and he yokes his ark to the fish using a lasso. The fish steers the ark through the turbulent waters, and then the world is washed away, begins anew, and then he lands and starts society. So not too similar, but not too different from the common story that we might have heard as a child from the Bible. So the symbols are everywhere. But the question is, can we get at the meaning behind the symbols? What is this story really about? And so what has happened is, in so many of our cultures, you look at the ancient Greek mysteries or the Roman mysteries or the Egyptian mysteries. These are cultures that date very far back, and they had lots of wisdom. But today there's no living tradition. There's just broken columns, monuments, some papyrus, but we don't have access to the wisdom of those initiates. So what we find is that in India, there has been an unbroken transmission of this knowledge. So we can look at a symbol that's shared by the entire world, like this flood myth, and when we turn to the tradition, to the lineage, we ask them, what does it mean? Well, I found in the Indian tradition, and again, this is an example, this flood myth, I've heard a meaning that I've never heard anywhere else. It's a very authentic, ancient meaning. And the way it's explained is this, is that the name Manu, right, we call it man, actually derived from the word manas, or mind. The fish we know through the symbols of many gods, such as Vishnu and Jesus, who are represented as fish. So what we find then is a story of the mind who's engaged in the pool of thought and comes across a fish, this little fish of divinity. And there are all sorts of big fishes like desire, lust, greed, anger, jealousy, right, that are going to eat this divine impulse alive. But if the mind is pure and righteous, as Manu or Manas was, it'll protect that spark of divinity. And if you protect God, there's a saying in Sanskrit, dharmo rakshati rakshata. One who protects righteousness is protected by righteousness. So if at that instance, when you get that divine impulse, you listen to it, you take care of it, you nurture it, it will grow to become something very big. Now in the ancient epic of Mahabharata, there's a wise king, and this wise king is asked, what is the most amazing thing in the world? And the king responds back and says, that a man, seeing others die all around him, never thinks that he will die. That a man, seeing others die all around him, never thinks that he will die. And that's exactly the case with our mind. Normally the mind can't contemplate its own death. It's arrogant, it's egotistical. But this divine impulse comes and says, hey, I'm the spark of infinity. I'm the soul within you. I'm telling you, you, the mind, are going to experience death. And that is what the end of the world is, or the great flood is not a flood of the world being destroyed in the objective sense, but of the world being destroyed in the subjective sense. Because when we do die, it's not we that end, it's the world that ends for us. So, talking about the scorching heat and the intolerable nature of the world is talking about the old age. So this fish is reminding him, there's going to be a point where your body's going to get old, frail, fragile, worn down. And all your life you've been building an ark. And when that point comes where the world ends, you're going to enter into that ark. What is the ark? The ark is our karma. It's this astral body, if you will, that we've constantly been building and sculpting by our thoughts, actions, deeds, words, right? So at the moment of death, he enters into, and we all enter into, our astral body. And God is there, the fish is there, but do we yoke ourselves to it or not? Now the word yoga actually comes from the same root word as our word yoke. It's yuj in Sanskrit. So there are specific forms and techniques of yoga at the moment of death, whereby one can yoke themselves to their own soul or to God, and thereby be led through the other worlds that come after death. And then what happens? The waters recede, the process of dying is over, and one's reborn into whatever heaven, hell, next life, whatever one believes happens afterwards. And so thereby we see that although the entire world has this story of the progenitor with the ark, because in India there is a well-preserved tradition, by studying that tradition, it gives us insights into whatever our version of that symbol is. And that's what I want to do today, is not to say that there is any relationship between Freemasonry and Vedanta, but instead to say, well, these symbols, how would they come alive to somebody who's a student of Vedanta? And as far as the Indian tradition goes, I'll give you one other anecdote to show how far back it goes. One of the first movements out of Africa by our early ancestors was 70 to 80,000 BC. And they trekked along the coastlines and ended up in South India. And so there were some linguists who were visiting South India maybe 20, 30 years ago, who were listening to these chants that these South Indian Brahmin priests had. And they were so strange because they followed rules, but the words had no meaning. So these linguists traced it back and back and back and tried to understand it. And they actually found that these chants, which were preserved by oral tradition, even to this day, you can hear them in South India, came from that time around 70 to 80,000 BC. And they weren't related to any known language, because this was a time not only prehistory, it was also pre-linguistic, pre-language. The closest they could link it to anything else was bird song. So there was a time where human beings spoke or communicated, made noise on that level of almost an animalistic mind. And that record has been preserved impeccably. So when we're looking to these concepts from India, we have to realize that they're not regionalistic. They're shared humanity. It's a perfect lineage of the ancient knowledge that existed in all times and places. And the only reason that we're turning to India is because it's been preserved since the most ancient of times. One of my favorite Masonic scholars, W.L. Wilmshurst, and my Masonic mentor gave me his book, The Day I Was Raised, says this. Says that all I wish to emphasize is that our present system is not one coming from remote antiquity, that there is no direct continuity between us and the Egyptians or even those ancient Hebrews who built, in the reign of King Solomon, a certain temple at Jerusalem. What is extremely ancient in Freemasonry is a spiritual doctrine concealed within the architectural phraseology. For this doctrine is an elementary form of the doctrine that has been taught in all ages, no matter in which garb it has been expressed. So this is the perennial philosophy that we want to look into. And Vedanta is going to be the gateway through which we look at it. Now, what does Vedanta mean? Veda means knowledge, Anta means end. So it's the end of knowledge. There is a point in between humanity and divinity that cannot be crossed by knowledge. There is a certain point you get to where thoughts cannot limit, thoughts cannot conceive, thoughts cannot describe the wonders. I think it was Meister Eckhart who said that there is nothing so holy as silence, or God speaks through silence. I mean, these are very common terms up here across the entire world. So Vedanta is that knowledge which will take us to the brink and sort of catapult us off the cliff into the unknown, into the indescribable, into the ineffable. The Vedas are also books. They're books, the holy books of India that date beyond any time that we could really say how far back the hymns go, but we're quite sure they were written down around 1700 to 1100 BC. And what we find is that at the end of the Vedas, right, at the Anta of the Vedas, are these things called Upanishads. Upanishad in Sanskrit means come sit near, and refers to the process by which the students would sit at the feet of the guru as they were meditating in lotus position, and they would discuss questions of life, death, immortality, morality, all the things that a guru could ever want to teach a student, and all the things that a student could ever want to know. So when we talk about Vedanta, we're both talking about the end of knowledge, the philosophical, epistemological end of what is possibly known, as well as these texts called Upanishads, which contained the earliest writings of that said knowledge. Now, the term knowledge itself is interesting. We think of knowledge as facts. But what the Vedanta knowledge was preparing people for was an experience. At the lowest form of human existence is apathy, people who don't care about anything, don't believe in love, for example. Next step will be belief. If you believe in something, you care about it, so you're beyond apathy. So where apathy ends, belief begins. And at this stage of belief, it's good to believe in love. Simply believing in it gives someone strength and courage. But it's better to know something than to simply experience it, right? So where belief ends, knowledge begins. And it's good to know love. Love chemically is oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine, adrenaline. Love, according to Shakespeare, what does he say? Love is not love that alters when it alteration finds. St. Paul describes love beautifully in the Corinthians. He says that if we don't have love, we're just, all words and all knowledge are just a noisy cymbal, a clanging gong, right? It's patient, it's kind. And so it's good to know what love is, but it's best to be in love. So where knowledge ends, experience begins. And this is the juncture of Vedanta. When you get to that point where you've attained the knowledge, there comes a place of realization of that knowledge, of experience of that knowledge. It's one thing to believe in God, it's another to know the nature of God, and it's another to experience union with God. And union is known in Sanskrit as yoga. So there are 3 stages of yoga. The first degree is described as one who desires to ascend the staircase of yoga. They desire to walk the steps of yoga. And they're placed in this category where they work constantly on the refinement and purification of their lower nature. And these steps are necessary before they can climb the steps and reach the second degree. The second degree, known as Yunjana, is one who's practicing towards ascension, where they begin the deeper practices of yoga to start to access their higher nature and commence mastery in the esoteric teachings of the mysteries. And the third degree, which is known as Yoga Arudha, is one who has ascended fully and transmuted their lower self into a purely spiritual self. And having realized all of the goals of this sacred craft of yoga, third degree yogis are considered spiritual masters. So these are the 3 steps of yoga, which we can very well relate as Masons who have all taken 3 steps. Now, what is this knowledge, right? They're techniques, and the techniques are worthwhile, but they're usually only received in a proper manner by initiation, just like the secrets of Masonry are only revealed by initiation, by guru to disciple, or by master to apprentice. So the techniques we can mostly leave off as not being appropriate for this venue, but what is the knowledge? Not the techniques to realize that knowledge and go to experience or liberation, moksha, samadhi, enlightenment, salvation. Not the experience. We'll leave the experience off, but let's talk about the knowledge portion. How does the knowledge of Vedanta, not the techniques that allow you to go beyond the knowledge, but how does that knowledge itself relate to Freemasonry? Well, what does Vedanta teach? What is the topic that it discusses? Well, reality. In short, what is the nature of reality? They posit essentially a duality between 2 things known as Prakriti and Purusha. We know as the yin and the yang, the matter and spirit, the earth and the heavens, right? The feminine and masculine. And what they said is that the existence, the truth underlying this seeming reality, was not a physical one known as Prakriti or matter. It's not made of matter, but it's in fact made of spirit or consciousness. So the universe is more of a thought than it is a thing. Vedanta and modern science teaches that the material world was created and will be destroyed. What we're in search of is that which is eternal, always true, always will be true, always has existed, always will exist. We want the unchanging. So Vedanta tells a story called the Hiranyagarbha. And in the Hiranyagarbha, which is a primeval atom, the womb of creation, consciousness entered into this womb and it exploded and formed our entire universe. Kind of like the Big Bang, in a sense. So what could have possibly existed before matter, space, and time, which were all created at that moment? Well, the great seers of Vedanta taught that before the dream exists, there must be a dreamer. Before there was a material world or a dream, there was a consciousness or a dreamer. The same way that when you fall asleep, an entire world bursts out of your mind. In your dream, there's a sun, there's a moon, there's gravity, there's this, there's that. There's all this duality. But underlying all that duality and all that multiplicity is just the mind of you, the dreamer. So too, is all this reality a dream in the mind of the prime dreamer, which they called Vishnu. So the prime dreamer existing before the Big Bang must have been self-manifested, unborn and undying, pure, formless, unconditioned consciousness. As all the dream world exists entirely in the mind of the dreamer, so too does everything in the universe exist within the mind of God. Thus, any perceived separation between humanity and divinity is only in perception, not in actuality. This false veil of ignorance they called Maya. Maya. So in the dream, when you fall asleep and you have a dream, you think that you're just a character in your dream. You don't think that you created the dream. You're just a character walking around, talking with other people. There are other people in your dream who seem just as real as you are. There's a sun that seems very ancient. So if I came to you in your dream, you'd say, no, I'm just this guy, I'm Joe Schmo in my dream. And I would say to you, no, you created this entire dream world. Nonsense, nonsense, nonsense. The reason you think it's nonsense is because you're taken in by the veil of Maya. Now, what the 3 steps of yoga are about getting beyond Maya and realizing one's true nature. Instead of calling humans sinful or fallen, they said that humans were by nature divine, being part of God. And they were just temporarily blinded by the illusion of separation. And this illusion hinges on the tendency of individuals to view themselves as merely a body. A body being matter was created and will be destroyed. However, the consciousness within it, being part of the primeval consciousness that manifested this universe through thought, was not created and thus cannot be destroyed. One of the great teachers of Vedanta was Krishna, who we've spoken about in the Bhagavad Gita. Here's what he said about consciousness. He said, consciousness cannot be wounded by weapons, burned by fire, drenched by water, or withered by the wind. He also said that its reality pervades all of time and space. It's not something you can touch, fathom, move, or modify. So in Vedanta, the supreme being, the grand architect, if you will, is understood as the consciousness that underlies all of existence. But what happened was people realized that in order for this knowledge to be realized, people couldn't simply intellectually grasp it, they had to experience it. And that's why there's the teaching of Vedanta and the practice of yoga. The two were inevitably connected. One is knowing the good, the other is experiencing it. So what we realize through the knowledge and the experience is that we are not a physical body. That's something that belongs to us. It's my body. I am not the body. The body belongs to me. It's my mind. Therefore, me and the mind are separate. It belongs to me, right? Like I would say my car. The car is there and I am here. The car belongs to me. Same thing, the body's over here. I am here. The body belongs to me. The mind belongs to me. The personality belongs to me. The memories, the actions, the deeds, the words, they all belong to me. But then who the heck am I? I am pure consciousness. As they say, Chitananda Rupa, Shivoham, Shivoham. I am the knowing bliss of consciousness. I am this primordial divinity. That's who I am. That's who I am. So then it makes sense now to turn to the most commonly known symbol of Freemasonry, at least in the United States, which is the all-seeing eye of God. Now, admitting that the definition and explanation of Vedanta that I've given so far is very rudimentary and very basic, not going into any depths about the nuance, this idea of the universe being a dream in the mind of God, and God being primordial consciousness, which is the base of all reality, should be enough to kind of dig into some of these symbols a little bit. So what we find is that deity is defined in Masonry as the all-seeing eye. That's the symbol we chose. So we know that it's shown in Christian art. We know that it was shown by Tibetan Buddhists, by the Egyptians, by many cultures have this one all-seeing eye. And on some level, its adoption within the institution of Masonry seems pretty natural. It's not the exclusive emblem of any particular religion, which suits Masonry's non-denominational purposes very well, because we impose no definition of what the supreme being has to be, and we accept good men of all faiths and all backgrounds. But it's not some sort of minimalist God. It's not just a common denominator, at least common denominator God. It's a hugely powerful symbol, so why is it? Why is it so powerful? It's not just because it's politically correct. So, what is the all-seeing eye if we are to understand it in light of Vedanta? Not to say that the founders of Masonry would have understood it this way, or that you have to understand it this way, but just as a thought experiment. How would a yogi, a Vedantin, understand this? So, the way that the all-seeing eye expresses itself within India is with the deity of Shiva. There are basically two paths that one can travel on within the Indian religion. The path of Vishnu, which is the householder path, whereby one lives a life of marriage, family, has kids, works, participates in society, participates in religion through ceremonies and devotion and faith and charity and ritual. And then the path of Shiva, where one becomes an ascetic, a monk, a mystic, meditates, ecstatic. The god Dionysus might be a pointer that one could think of if they're trying to conceive of what the path of Shiva looks like. So Shiva is known as the force that destroys the universe, and Vishnu is known as the force that maintains the universe. So we can see that the life of somebody who follows the Vishnu path is about living in the world, doing good, preserving. The Shiva is trying to destroy this world and awaken from it into the mind of God, destroy the dream, and wake up from the illusion in a mystical, mystery-oriented way. So what we find is that Shiva is bestowed with a third eye. Two normal eyes, and then one eye vertically here. It's placed vertically above the two horizontal human eyes. Now consider the significance of the third eye's placement in light of the Vedantic understanding of deity. The two human eyes symbolize the material world as understood by the senses, and appear to have duality, because there's two of them, and fragmentation. So these two eyes, which see the senses, which are part of the senses, see this world of duality and fragmentation. However, the single spiritual eye, representing that above the material world there is a transcendent spiritual world which we learn by insight. It's non-dual. So that's what this third eye represents. Now when you see the inversion of it, the reason it's not horizontal is because it's literally an inversion. It's turning the world completely topsy-turvy. Krishna says that, what is day to a regular person is night to a yogi, and what is night to a yogi is day to the regular person. The world of fleeting happiness, which was day to to the average person will fade into the darkness of night if they perform yoga. And the world of lasting peace, which was night to the average person, shall be revealed clear as daytime to the yogi. So it's literally the exact opposite. Right now, we think this world is real and God is just some idea. Then it's the exact opposite, where God is real and the world is just an idea in the mind of God. So this is the degree of twist that happens when we consider the path of Shiva, the path of the mysteries. And that's why you find, in fact, that Shiva is always meditating with a technique where his eyes are half closed and his eyeballs are looking up at this third eye, as if to tell us that he's only half open to this world, because this world is a mix of matter and spirit. So he's closed to the matter, open to the spirit of this world, but his third eye is always fully open. So he's always looking upwards towards the non-dual reality, which is symbolized by the third eye. So this is simply one concept, one application of a Masonic symbol. Another one might be the three great lights. The process of perfection of yoga can be understood in three distinct stages that correspond both with degrees of external and internal understanding. External understanding refers to our outlook on how the individual and divinity are related, and internal understanding refers to our conception of self. And so as one's understanding of who they are changes, so does their understanding of what God is and what the world is, and vice versa. So one of the most revered Indian sages was known as Hanuman. And Hanuman was considered to be one of the most ardent devotees of God. And so when he was asked to define his relationship with the Lord, he did so using three lines that each portrayed a different conception of self and its resulting different relationship with divinity. And so he defines, inadvertently, but he defines the three steps that one takes along the path of yoga. This is what he says. When I consider my body, and he's speaking directly to God here. When I consider my body, I am your servant. Complete duality. When I consider myself, my mind, I am part of you. Partial union. But when I consider my soul, you and I are one. Full union. So if we're strictly a body, we're a servant to God. If we're a mind, we're a part of the dream of God, part of the mind of God. And if we consider our soul and God are one. They're one and the same entity, one and the same structure. And the soul is beyond matter, space, and time. So it's literally impossible to say that, well, the soul is a piece of God. Well, no. There's no such thing as a piece. A piece means shape, which means space. But there's no space for the soul. God isn't bound by dimensions and space, right? So these are the three steps according to the Vedanta. What he explained was the relationship between internal and external understanding. At birth, we're bewildered. We take ourselves to be just simply a body. The pleasures of the body are the only pleasures we know, and the pains of the body are the only pains we feel. Our needs at this level are strictly physiological. As we mature, however, we consider ourselves our mind, our thoughts, our personality, and so on. So the pleasures and pain we experience are mostly mental. Success, love, anger, jealousy. And many people stay at this point throughout their entire lives, strictly dealing with the mental pleasures, which are still part of duality. There's still separation between man and divinity. But the great adepts, the great yogis, the great master masons of spirituality, progress to realize that their true identity is the soul, the pure consciousness. And at this point of realization, one's needs and pains vanish altogether, and existence at this level alone is a source of never-ending bliss. The body, being matter, is subservient to spirit, the thoughts being supported by consciousness are partial manifestations of spirit, and the self, being pure consciousness itself, is one and the same as spirit. So as a seeker progresses through the 3 degrees of yoga, different understandings and different practices arise because of different aspects of the self that they're studying. On the level of the body, the challenge is the physical discipline and purification of body. This is what we call yoga in the West. It's the twisting of the arms and the bending over backwards and the downward facing dogs, turning yourself into a pretzel. And I say that with love because I do practice the physical yoga as well. But on the level of the mind, the challenge is mental discipline and purity of thought. It's a process of gradually cleansing the mind, the alchemy of the mind, if you will. And finally, one gets beyond the mind, right, beyond knowledge, to the anta of the Veda, the end of knowledge. And at the level of the self, one has become a realized master and has thus reached the end of their life's journey. And in the East and West, these concepts of, is God separate from man, part of man, this or that, have always been kind of tricky. And they're seen as irreconcilable often. But leave it to a Freemason to explain it. This is Swami Vivekananda, who's considered by many to have been the first self-realized master, yogi, to visit the United States. His lectures, especially at the Parliament of World Religions, are among the clearest and most cherished explanations of the perennial philosophy. It's interesting because we vowed as Masons that we stand ready to be tried. And he was at the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago, and right alongside of it was a Masonic convention. So some of the Masons from Chicago actually tested him and quizzed him on his Masonic material, and he was up to snuff. He was raised on May 20th, 1884 in Anchor and Hope, Lodge number 1 in Kolkata, India. And he is revered as the patron saint of India. Words cannot express the awe and reverence that Hindus, Christians, Muslims, Jews, Zoroastrians, Buddhists, all religions of India have for this man, because he spoke in universal terms. And here's what he says about these 3 stages, 3 steps. Not to say that this was influenced by Masonry, but it rings very Masonic to me. Our solution is that the non-dualism, known as Advaita, is not antagonistic to the dualism known as Dvaita. We say the latter is only one of 3 steps. Religion always takes 3 steps. The first is dualism, then man gets to a higher state, partial non-dualism, and at last he finds he is one with the universe. Therefore the 3 do not contradict but fulfill. And we thus see, and this is my writing now, we thus see the meaning of the changing positions of the 3 great lights of Masonry, which indicate these stages of progress. As the Holy Bible is the foundation upon which the square and compasses rest, so the basis for one's growth is the immutable laws of nature that the volume of sacred law symbolically represents. These laws of nature are born from the properties of consciousness, God, and its interplay with matter. Without the relationship between spirit and matter, there would be no constancy or pattern by which the individual could study and understand the blueprints on God's trestle board. Because man is subject to only those laws which he gives himself, our process is one of individual growth and understanding of the world and self. The question becomes one of application of our free will. What is the proper end to which we ought to exert ourselves? As phrased by our brother, the Duke of Sussex, he says, "What use then should man make of this privileged autonomy of self-government, that he may prove worthy of this high prerogative? What principle should he govern his actions? By what square should he construct those laws which he gives himself?" There can be but one simple answer to these questions, namely, so to act that the principle of his actions may be exalted to a law of nature, to act in that manner only in which he thinks that he, who has given to nature its immutable laws, would have compelled man to act had he chosen to introduce compulsion into the realm of the mind in order to realize his designs. According to several Masonic authors like Albert Mackey and Albert Pike, the process of lifting the ends of the compasses over the square in 3 distinct motions represents the process of lifting the higher spiritual principle over the lower material nature. The discernment to circumscribe desires must fully rest on the moral square, as supported by the universal laws of all true scripture, not on man-made laws. When the masculine compasses of spirit are restored to its rightful position over the feminine square of matter, the transcendence of consciousness becomes apparent to the initiate. This is the process of the 3 steps of the gradual raising of the great lights. And is that which we've been talking about throughout all of yoga. It's a beautiful and holy process, and we're all engaged in it, sometimes in a symbolic way by performing ritual and ceremony, but also times in doing our own inner work. It's no coincidence that in the sacred architecture and geometry of both India and the West, temples and lodge rooms represent the human body. And it's no coincidence that as a chaplain, I sit next to the soul, the worshipful master of the body. Because the consciousness is the soul of the body, and the spiritual intuition sits on one side, and the knowledge of past sits on the other. And it directs itself to the altar of the heart, the feet at the far west, and the arms on the side. And we are symbolically entering into a human body in our lodge rooms and performing ritual that reminds us, and ought to remind us, of what we're trying to do internally. And there's no better, more powerful explanation than these 3 great lights transcending. So what we find is that at the final stage of becoming a master, our free will is completely utilized in carrying out the architect's design without desire for reward or fear of punishment, only done for the sake of the work itself. Karmanya vadikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana. That's what Krishna says. He says, work for the sake of the work itself. The ends are beyond your control, so never act for a reward. It's this idea that the master mason does. It's not about the wages. It's about the quality of the workmanship itself. So at this stage, there's no distinction between the builder's will and the architect's will. And so too does the self-realized master dissolve his narrow ego into the immensity of the pure unconditional being. And so each of us is born as a rough ashlar in a state of ignorance, thinking that we're just our imperfect bodies. But using the intellectual working tools of masonry, we use a gavel to remove chunks of attachment, selfishness, and ignorance that prevent us from our own inherent perfection. That is within us, just as the perfect ashlar is always within the rough ashlar. And so we don't seek perfection abroad, but we remove the flaws that conceal our inner greatness. We peel back the layers of Maya, the layers of illusion, and realize that we are in fact purely spiritual beings. And that's why we ask for the light of knowledge in masonry, so that we can illuminate our own heart hidden away in the lodge of the body. Knowing our divine nature through self-knowledge, Masons escape the poverty of ignorance. We rise up the ranks to become the master of our own being, and in this state of enlightenment, we become perfect. As a perfectly squared stone, our duty is no longer to ourselves but to the world. When we become a perfect ashlar, we become ready to be placed into the great temple of humanity, according to the blueprint laid down by the grand architect himself. And for this reason, the self-realized masters of the Vedanta tradition, the great yogis, the great master masons, the great teachers of all the mysteries, have become the perfect custodians of the brotherhood of man, as well as the perfect messengers of the fatherhood of God. And it is to experience, not just intellectually understanding, but experiencing the end of this knowledge, the process by which our thought fades out and our spiritual intuition lives within us, where we realize our true nature. This is the high and mighty goal that our craft of masonry and indeed the entire world aspires to. So this is a little bit about Vedanta and what some of these symbols, like the lights, the lodge-room, the volume of sacred law, the ashlars represent, the all-seeing eye represents, in light of Vedanta. I thank you so much for your time, and we end by saying Namaste. The divinity within me recognizes and bows to the divinity within you. Thank you.